Welcome. Today's lesson we will deal with institutional repositories. Information and communication technology have great potential for the advancement and dissemination of knowledge. ICT enables new ways and means of sharing knowledge and new opportunities for institutions to use their intellectual capital as a more effective indicator of academic quality. The need for institutional repositories arises out of a growing crisis in scholarly communication. Over the last 25 years, subscription prices to scholarly publications have increased at a rate so significant that many libraries have been forced to reduce their subscriptions. At the same time, the funding for libraries have stayed stagnant. Institutional repositories offer a strategic response both to the opportunities of the digital networked environment and to the systematic problem in the scholarly communication. Institutional repositories are largely linked to the notion of a digital library, that is, collecting, housing, classifying, cataloging, preserving and providing access to digital contents, analogous with the library's conventional function of collecting, classifying, preserving and providing access to analog content. Repositories may be limited to one field, one department, one institution or a consortium of several institutions. Development of institutional repositories has largely taken place in universities. The open access and open archives movement, the need for changes in scholarly communication to remove barriers to access, and the increasing awareness that universities and research institutions are losing valuable digital and print material have begun driving the establishment of institutional repositories. What is an institutional repository? There are many definitions available while defining institutional repositories. An institutional repository may be defined as a set of services that the institution offers to the scholarly community for the management and dissemination of digital materials created by the institution and its community members. It is an electronic archive of the scientific and scholarly outputs of an institution which have been stored in a searchable digital format and which are able to be retrieved for later use internally, nationally and worldwide. An institutional repository is a type of digital library that captures the original research and other intellectual property generated by an institution's constituent population active in many fields. According to Crow, institutional repositories have two main rationales. Firstly, they will form part of a global system of distributed interoperable repositories that will facilitate reform of the scholarly communication system. Secondly, they will enhance an institution's visibility and prestige. An institutional repository is an online locus for collecting, preserving and disseminating the digital form of the intellectual output of an institution, particularly a research institution. While repositories like ARXIV or CogPrints focus on particular subject domains, institutional repositories store and make accessible the outputs of institutions. In this, they are not necessarily limited to e-prints of the research literature, but can provide an institutional focus for the collection and preservation of scientific data, learning resources, image collections, and many other different types of content. An institutional repository is a set of services offered by a university to manage and make accessible scholarly digital materials created by the university and its community members. For university, the materials include research articles before preprints and after postprints, undergoing peer review, and digital versions of theses and dissertations, but it might also include other digital assets generated by normal academic life such as administrative documents, course notes, or learning objects. Repositories are simply databases, and what distinguishes institutional repositories is the idea that an internal database can serve more than an administrative purpose and can constitute a building block in a distributed internal service which is a virtual database composed of a user-defined set of cooperating databases on the network. Institutional repositories are perhaps particularly applicable in the context of research publications as they emanate from institutions and, with the right technology in place, can be caught at source and built into service. Researchers are rewarded for their work not financially but through its impact. They want their research to be read, consumed and understood. They want their peers to comment on it, credit it and add to it or extend it. Naturally, they want to receive credit for adding to human knowledge of the world. Equally, they want to help make the world a better place. The conventional method of research dissemination via publication in journals is much more limited in its possible impact than in the new method of publication of the same research in open access repositories. Studies have already shown that open access research papers are read more widely and therefore cited more frequently than papers which are not housed in repositories. The consequences of this is that they have greater impact. Institutional repositories are now being created to manage, preserve and maintain the digital assets, intellectual output and histories of institutions. Librarians are taking leadership roles in planning and building these repositories, fulfilling their roles as experts in collecting, describing, preserving and providing stewardship for documents and digital information. Why institutional repository? Institutional repository has strong role for institutions in open access scenario. It allows the storage and easy retrieval of many types of institutional information. Repositories offer the opportunities to organize and maintain all of the institution's scholarly documents in one location, which is accessible to everyone in the institution as well as the global community. It can encourage the exploration and adaptation of new forms of scholarly communication that exploit the digital medium in fundamental ways. It can support new practices of scholarship that emphasize data as an integral part of the record and discourse of scholarship. Repositories can structure and make effective otherwise diffuse efforts to capture and disseminate learning and teaching material, symposia and performances, and related documentation of the intellectual life of institutions. In addition to the practical benefits, repositories also offer an opportunity to bring visibility to the institution and individual members. Institutional repositories also have roles beyond disseminating and managing the works of individual scholars that are a part of the dialogue of scholarly communication. Institutional repositories facilitate a number of activities that include digital access management, preservation of digital assets, and facilitating discovery of content. Objectives of institutional repositories. Following are the major objectives of having an institutional repository. 1. To provide open access to institutional research output by self-archiving it. 2. To create global availability for an institution's scholarly research. 3. To collect contents in a single location. 4. To store and preserve other institutional digital assets, including unpublished or otherwise equally lost grey literature, like thesis or technical reports. Characteristics of institutional repositories. The following are the basic characteristics of institutional repositories. The material is scholarly in nature. The content is created at the host institution, employs self-archiving techniques, open access, interoperable. Contents of institutional repositories. Research communities, in coordination with developers of institutional repositories, have to decide the kind of materials to be deposited in institutional repositories. Some of the types of content are described below: electronic theses and dissertations, conference papers and proceedings, preprints and postprints of journal articles, books and data sets, working papers and reports, teaching and learning objects, multimedia collection. Benefits of institutional repositories. Demonstrate the quality and scientific, social and economic relevance of an institution's research. Long-term preservation, organization, access and distribution of research content. Improved scholarly communication through interoperable open access institutional repositories. organizational support for innovative approaches to research dissemination, increase the institution's visibility, status, and public value. Improved research knowledge management. Following are the main benefits for researchers: wider access and visibility, improved impact, share unpublished ideas and know-hows, rapid communication of research, long-term preservation of research papers, complement and supplement journal publishing, promote collaborative research, abstract research funding, establish priority for research findings, easy access to faculty paper by students, and facilitate knowledge sharing and reuse. Access. Repositories represent potentially rich sources of information, data, images, and are valuable research results. Each institution defines its own policies dealing with access to and use of materials in repositories. Not all materials can be made available freely. Copyrighted materials may carry a variety of restrictions. Non-exclusive publisher license would increase availability of these materials and place the publisher in the open access arena. Some publishers permit authors to self-archive. Other publishers opt for exclusive licenses for a limited time, while still others will not allow any deviation from exclusive copyright. Some materials may be restricted to a small group of researchers or to people associated with the institution. For example, a group working on a patentable device or process may want to share data only with members of the group. Policies. Librarians both use and create institutional repositories. In established repositories, there are a variety of decisions to be made. Policies, systems architecture, and other elements will depend on institutional context and the scope and purpose of the repository. Policies appropriate for an academic institution may not work in a corporate setting. Not-for-profit organizations have unique purposes and cultures that will dictate how their repositories are formed and maintained. Key issues to consider when developing repositories. The institutional culture. Institutional culture depends on how the organization is structured as well as how much collaboration and trust exist within an institution. In academic organizations, faculty belongs to departments, disciplines, and research groups. In an internally competitive environment where cooperation and trust are not nurtured, building a repository will become more difficult. Faculty will not contribute willingly to a central repository unless they have been consulted and trust the process. Faculty need to be convinced that contributing to a repository will enhance their reputation in their discipline and result in wider dissemination of their work. The scope of the repository. Repository advocates must decide early on the purpose and scope of the repository and communicate them to all affected parties. Will the repository be central, distributed? Will it cover only parts or all of the organization? Large and complex institutions will need consensus on key issues and technical standards. A repository may be limited to self-archiving by authors or may include the intellectual output and administrative documents for the whole institution. Many institutions have treasures known only to few people. Repository provide the means for unearthing these treasures and bringing them to light. Structure. Most repository applications will allow a considerable degree of freedom in how to set up a repository for a particular institution. Institution then need to decide whether to recreate the whole organization's form, that is, faculty, department, research groups, in their repository structure or to adopt a different approach such as by subject. In reaching this decision, institutional politics will need to be considered. Departments that deposit a high quantity of material, for example, are likely to want their relative weight to be labeled with their departmental name. Content. Decision-making on content can become a contentious issue. Criteria for deposit into the repository could come from each community or from a central body with output from the participant. Legal aspects. Librarians and administrators responsible for operating and maintaining repositories need to ensure that all legal requirements are met. These requirements include appropriate software and content licenses. Many universities have comprehensive intellectual property policies setting forth the responsibility of faculty and administration. Corporations and not-for-profit organizations may have formal intellectual property policies. In some cases, intellectual property issues may be covered in employment contracts. Standards. Interoperability requires that repositories employ standards developed to handle issues associated with open access. These standards include the Open Archival Information System (OAIS), Reference Model, Open Archives Metadata Harvesting Protocol (OAI PMH), and the Metadata Encoding and Transmission Standards or METS. Librarians, archivists, faculty and information technology staff have gained increased understanding of each other's work and learned to work more collaboratively in recent years. Each group now recognizes and appreciates the expertise and creativity of the other. The talent and commitment of time and energy from each group are essential to the success of a repository project. Creation and sustainability of a repository heavily depend on thinking together and learning what others on the team think, so decisions can be made within their working content. Sustainability. Maintenance and sustainability are key issues that involve the long-term commitment of money by management. A repository cannot run by itself. It needs constant attention. Maintenance of content, software, and accessibility can change. IT staff and librarians need to know the consequences of change in hardware, software, and standards and be able to adjust accordingly. Funding. Repositories cannot be sustained without long-term infusion of funds. Everyone involved in a repository needs to understand that the project has become part of their everyday lives and will require attention and funding in perpetuity. Now let us summarize the session. Here an attempt has been made to discuss the concept and meaning of institutional repositories. An institutional repository is an online locus for collecting, preserving and disseminating the digital form of the intellectual output of an institution, particularly a research institution. While institutional repositories centralize, preserve and make accessible an institution's intellectual capital, at the same time, they will form part of a global system of distributed, interoperable repositories that provides the foundation for a new disintegrated model of scholarly publishing. Repositories can create positive outcomes for all interested groups. Authors gain visibility, information seekers can find research material more easily, institutions raise their research profile, and funders see wide research dissemination. Repositories now represent potentially rich sources of information, data, images, and valuable research results. In establishing repositories, there are a variety of decisions to be made. Policies, systems architecture, and other elements will depend on institutional context and the scope and purpose of the repository. Institutional culture depends on how the organization is structured as well as how much collaboration and trust exist within these institutions. Librarians and administrators responsible for operating and maintaining repositories need to ensure that all legal requirements are met. These requirements include appropriate software and content license. Interoperability requires that repositories employ standard development to handle issues associated with open access. The open access movement and institutional repositories could contribute significantly to economic growth by broadening the market for scholarly publications and research results. Before we attend the next unit, please try to answer the following questions. What is an institutional repository? What are the contents of an institutional repository? What are the benefits of an institutional repository? And discuss the key issues to be considered while developing an institutional repository. The case for institutional repositories, a SPARC position paper, Washington, D.C., Scholarly Publishing and Academics Resources Coalition, Crow R. 2002. The Institutional Repository, Jones Richard, Andrew Theo and Malcolm John, 2006, Oxford Chandos Publishing. Institutional Repositories in Indian Universities and Research Institutes, a study. Electronic Library and Information Systems. M. Krishnamurthy and Kemparaju T.D., 2011. Institutional Repositories in India, a preliminary study, Library High-Tech News, Sarika S., 2010. Institutional Repositories towards the Identification of Critical Success Factor, Canadian Journal of Library and Information Studies, Catherine Shearer, 2003. Thank you for watching this session. We hope that it was useful. Until later next time, goodbye.